The relentless hammering jolted me awake, echoing through the crisp morning air outside my cozy cabin. Throwing on my trusty blue hoodie from high school, I stumbled out the door, squinting against the sunlight, only to freeze at the sight before me, a crew in glaring yellow vests hammering away at a fence blocking the dirt road to my place. A sign slapped on it read, "Area under HOA management, no trespassing." I stood there, dumbfounded. An HOA here? They were gunning for me, claiming my cabin clashed with their so-called community values. Letters started piling up, drones buzzed overhead, and whispers spread like wildfire. But they underestimated one thing: that fence they built. It was on the only bridge linking their precious neighborhood to the outside world. Oh, they had no idea who they were messing with. I'm ready to fight back. Are you with me? I'm dying to know, have you ever faced a rogue HOA? The woman orchestrating this chaos was Brandy Keller, a 32-year-old with brittle, over-bleached hair and crooked acrylic nails that screamed desperate for attention. Her mustard yellow blazer, probably pricier than my monthly groceries, made her look like a walking caution sign. As the self-proclaimed president of Willowbrook Heights, HOA, she strutted up with a clipboard, her voice dripping with fake authority that made my skin crawl. "Mr. Brooks," she announced, like she was serving a royal decree, "your property is causing significant aesthetic and safety concerns for our community members. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us. If you have any confrontation with the HOA, we'll narrate your story on our channel. We're prepared to offer you a generous buyout opportunity." When I asked what gave her the right to make demands about my property, her smile turned ice cold. "This is a family-friendly neighborhood, Mr. Brooks. We need to maintain certain standards. I had inherited this cabin from my grandfather 3 years ago, and it had been my peaceful retreat from the world ever since I started working as a freelance electrician in the area. The place had its history. The previous tenant had been accused of growing marijuana here, and I'd spent months cleaning up that mess to restore the property's reputation. Now I lived quietly, working honest jobs for local contractors, wearing my grandfather's old green leather jacket and faded navy denim that had seen better days. I wasn't bothering anyone, and my cabin sat on land that I legally owned, far enough from their precious subdivision that it shouldn't have mattered to them. But apparently Brandy had other plans. She handed me a business card with an offer that was barely 40% of what the property was actually worth. "You have 30 days to consider this generous offer," she said, her yellow blazer catching the morning sunlight like a warning beacon. "After that, well, let's just say things might get more complicated for you." The whole interaction left me feeling unsettled but also angry. I had worked hard to build a good reputation in this community after the cannabis scandal, taking on electrical jobs for half the contractors in the county and proving myself as a reliable, skilled tradesman. Now, this woman in her gaudy yellow outfit was threatening to destroy everything I'd rebuilt. As she walked away with her construction crew, I noticed how she kept glancing back at my cabin and taking photos with her phone, like she was documenting evidence for some kind of case she was building against me. The fence they erected was clearly meant to intimidate me, but it was also blocking access to the main road for anyone who might want to visit my property. It was a power play, pure and simple, and Brandy Keller had just declared war on the wrong person. What she didn't know was that her little fence-building project had just become the biggest mistake of her life. The next week, Brandy escalated her campaign with a barrage of official-looking violation notices, each one delivered by her in increasingly bright yellow outfits that made her look like a walking traffic cone. This time, she wore a neon yellow t-shirt that practically glowed in the sunlight, paired with those same crooked acrylic nails and an attitude that had grown even more aggressive. She'd consolidated her complaints into 3 main categories that she rattled off like she was reading from a legal textbook. Your cabin's railing is the wrong color. It should be white, like the community standard. You're creating noise pollution.
Even though you live a full mile away from the nearest house, and your old pickup truck is a security violation that damages our aesthetic appeal.
Each violation notice came with threats of legal action and fines that seemed to increase with every delivery. When I called her to dispute these ridiculous claims, her voice turned sharp and hostile. "You'll see the full power of this community working against you, Mr. Brooks. We protect our property values here." But Bry's real cunning showed itself 3 days later when a well-dressed man in an expensive suit knocked on my cabin door, introducing himself as a property investor who'd heard I might be interested in selling. He offered me a price that was actually above market value, claiming he represented a development company that specialized in rustic vacation properties. Something felt off about his rehearsed pitch and the way he kept glancing at his phone. So I politely declined and watched him drive away in a rental car. It wasn't until Frank Dawson pulled me aside later that week that I understood what had really happened. "That was one of Bry's tricks," Frank explained with a knowing shake of his head. "She sends fake buyers to properties she wants, hoping people will get greedy and sell quickly before they realize what their land is really worth. The guy probably doesn't even work for a real company, just some actor she hired to make you think you were getting a good deal." What Brandy didn't realize was that I had done my homework as a trained electrician who knew how to read property surveys and legal documents. My cabin sat well outside the jurisdiction of her HOA on land that had been in my family for decades, before her precious Willowbrook Heights subdivision even existed. I spent hours researching property lines, HOA boundaries, and local ordinances using the same methodical approach I brought to complex electrical installation. When I called her back with this information, she became even more aggressive, insisting that community standards applied to everyone in the area, regardless of official boundaries. "You think you can just live however you want out there?" she snapped during our heated phone conversation. "This is about being a good neighbor and respecting the families who have invested in this community." Her voice had a desperate edge to it, like someone who was used to getting her way through intimidation and couldn't handle being challenged. That's when Frank Dawson approached me. Frank was a 58-year-old retired plumber who lived in the HOA community but had grown tired of Bry's increasingly authoritarian tactics. He was a stocky guy with callous hands and a non-nonsense attitude who reminded me of the honest contractors I worked with every day. "Ethan," he said, pulling me aside at the local hardware store where I was picking up supplies for a job, "there's something you need to know about what Bry's really up to here. She's not just trying to buy out your cabin for neighborhood aesthetics. She's got investors interested in turning this whole area into some kind of mini resort development." Frank explained that Brandy had been systematically targeting properties around the subdivision, using her HOA position to pressure people into selling below market value. She's got a whole crew of what she calls her gossip moms, women she helped, out during her real estate days who now do her dirty work, spreading rumors and applying social pressure. The internal politics of the HOA were more complicated than I'd realized. There was another resident named Diane Marshall who wanted to challenge Brandy for the presidency, and she'd been quietly documenting Bry's overreach for months. At the next monthly HOA meeting, Diane finally spoke up during the public comment period, questioning why the organization was spending so much time and money on properties that weren't even within their jurisdiction. "I've reviewed our bylaws," Diane announced to the surprised crowd, "and I can't find any legal authority for the HOA to regulate properties outside our subdivision boundaries." Bry's face flushed red as she tried to maintain control, insisting that community standards were about more than just legal technicalities. The tension in that room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and several residents started murmuring among themselves about what Diane had said. Meanwhile, the HOA secretary was a 26-year-old law student named Elise Harper, who was caught in the middle. She needed the part-time income from her secretary position to help pay for school, but Brandy had been threatening to sabotage her scholarship applications if she didn't cooperate with increasingly questionable demands. Frank's warning stuck with me as I drove home in my old pickup truck, still wearing my faded denim jacket and thinking about everything he'd told me. Brandy wasn't just some overzealous HOA president. She was someone with bigger ambitions who saw my cabin as an obstacle to her plans. The fact that she'd enlisted a crew of supporters meant this was going to get messier before it got better. But now I knew that cracks were starting to show in her support base. Diane Marshall's public challenge had rattled Brandy more than she wanted to admit, and I could sense that other residents were beginning to question her authority. I'd spent my career solving complex electrical problems that required patience, methodical thinking, and attention to detail. I had a feeling those same skills were about to become very useful in dealing with Brandy Keller. What I didn't know yet was that Frank had more information to share, information that would completely change how I understood this whole situation. Frank led me down to my cabin's basement the next evening, pointing to a dusty cardboard box I'd never bothered to open since inheriting the property. "Your grandfather was a smart man, Ethan," Frank said, his weathered hands careful as he lifted the lid. "He knew this area might get developed someday, and he made sure to protect what was his." Inside the box were the original property deeds from my grandfather's time, yellowed with age, but still legally binding. As I read through the documents with Frank's help, one detail jumped out that made my heart race. I owned Old Mill Bridge, the only bridge that provided access into and out of the Willowbrook Heights subdivision. But it was the handwritten letter tucked beneath the deeds that really explained everything. In my grandfather's careful script, he'd written to my grandson, "I bought this bridge in 1968 after the county tried to reroute traffic away from our family land. Some developer friends of theirs wanted to isolate us, so we'd be forced to sell cheap. Never let anyone control your way home, son. This bridge is your insurance policy against bullies and land grabbers. Use it wisely." The implications hit me like a bolt of lightning. Every single resident of Willowbrook Heights, including Brandy herself, had to cross my bridge to get to work, school, grocery shopping, or anywhere else. It was the only route in or out of their subdivision, something that had never mattered when my grandfather built friendly relationships with his neighbors decades ago. But now, with Brandy trying to force me out through intimidation and legal threats, this bridge ownership changed everything. I spent the night reading through every document in that box, using my technical background to understand the property, surveys, and legal language. The bridge ownership was ironclad, complete with maintenance responsibilities and exclusive access rights that had been legally established long before the HOA even existed. My grandfather hadn't just bought a bridge. He'd bought insurance against exactly the kind of situation I was facing now. And his letter showed he'd faced similar pressure from developers who wanted to control the area. The next day, Brandy escalated again with what she called a surprise inspection, showing up at my cabin wearing a bright orange-yellow cardigan that looked like it belonged in a 1980s music video. She brought her husband, Mark, a thin, nervous-looking accountant who kept saying, "Yes, dear," to everything she demanded, plus someone she introduced as a building inspector who was obviously fake. His clipboard was empty, and he kept looking to Brandy for cues about what he was supposed to be inspecting. "Mr. Brooks," Brandy announced with theatrical authority, "we've received reports about structural violations that could require us to condemn this building as unsafe." Her fake inspector nodded along, mumbling about foundation problems and safety hazards that any real electrician could see were completely fabricated. But then she went too far. "We're also concerned about your electrical system. Anonymous reports suggest it might be a fire hazard that could threaten the entire area. This was where my professional expertise came in handy. I invited them to examine my electrical work, knowing full well that every installation I'd done was up to code and properly documented. Actually, I said, pulling out my professional certifications and work permits. I'd be happy to show you the electrical system. I installed most of it myself, and it's all been inspected and approved by the county. Bry's fake inspector suddenly looked very uncomfortable as I started explaining the technical details of modern electrical safety standards, circuit breakers, and grounding systems. In fact, I continued enjoying the moment. If you're concerned about electrical safety in the area, I'd be happy to inspect the wiring in your subdivision. Some of those houses were built in the 1990s with electrical systems that might not meet current standards. The fake inspector made some excuse about needing to check other properties and quickly left, leaving Brandy sputtering about how this wasn't over and that legal complications were going to make everything much more expensive for me. I watched this performance without revealing what I now knew about the bridge, keeping my expression neutral while my mind raced through the possibilities. Brandy was clearly getting desperate, moving from legal intimidation to outright fraud with her
Fake inspector routine.
She had no idea that her aggressive tactics were about to backfire spectacularly. Meanwhile, I had started quietly researching the legal aspects of bridge ownership, consulting with a real lawyer who confirmed that my rights were completely legitimate, and that any attempt to block access to my property would be illegal. The lawyer also mentioned that documenting harassment campaigns could be useful if the situation escalated further. I began taking detailed notes of every interaction with Brandy, every fake violation notice, and every attempt at intimidation, building a comprehensive record of her misconduct. Behind the scenes, the HOA politics were getting more interesting. Elise Harper had reached a moral breaking point and started secretly texting me warnings about Bry's plans. Meeting tomorrow at 3 p.m. read one message. She's planning something big. Be careful. These insider tips helped me stay one step ahead of Bry's schemes, and I could tell that Elise was struggling with her conscience about participating in what she knew was wrong. Diane Marshall was collecting evidence of financial irregularities and how Brandy managed the HOA budget, and she'd started building a coalition of residents who were tired of the increasingly authoritarian leadership. She's telling everyone you're some kind of dangerous loner who's bringing down their property values, Frank reported after another HOA meeting. But some people are starting to see through her act. The problem is, most folks are too scared of her to speak up publicly. As I processed all this information, I realized that Brandy had created a lot of enemies through her approach, but she was also becoming more desperate and unpredictable as her support base started to crack. That night, I stood at my cabin window looking out at the old bridge in the moonlight, finally understanding why my grandfather had been so strategic about purchasing it all those years ago. He'd seen the potential for conflict and had quietly secured the one piece of leverage that would matter most. Reading his letter again, I felt a connection to him that went beyond just inheriting property. He'd faced similar bullies and had outmaneuvered them through patience and strategic thinking. Randy thought she held all the power with her HOA position in her investor connections, but she'd built her entire strategy on a fundamental misunderstanding of who actually controlled access to her precious subdivision. Now, I just had to decide how and when to use this information. The smart move would be to wait and let Brandy continue digging her own hole deeper before revealing my trump card. Little did I know she was about to cross a line that would make that decision much easier. Bry's next move was to organize what she called a community pressure campaign, and she coordinated it while wearing the most aggressively bright yellow blazer I'd ever seen, the kind that probably violated several laws about causing traffic accidents. She'd mobilized her crew of gossip moms to spread rumors throughout the subdivision and the broader community, painting me as a suspicious man living alone in the woods who might be involved in illegal activities. The whisper campaign was surprisingly effective, with people suddenly giving me strange looks when I showed up at job sites or stopped by the hardware store. Frank kept me updated on the rumors. They were suggesting I might be running some kind of drug operation, storing weapons, or planning something dangerous that threatened community safety. "She's got them convinced you're some kind of criminal," Frank reported, shaking his head in disgust. "Never mind that you've been doing honest electrical work for half the contractors in this county for 3 years. The harassment escalated when Brandy hired private security guards to patrol near my cabin under the pretense of community safety concerns. These weren't real police officers. They were rent cops with cheap uniforms and overinflated egos who would drive slowly past my property multiple times a day, taking photos and making notes on clipboards. One afternoon, I caught them trespassing on my land to cut down a tree that was technically on my side of the property line. When I confronted them, they claimed they were maintaining community aesthetics and threatened to call real police if I interfered with their official duties. It was pure intimidation, designed to make me feel isolated and watched constantly. Meanwhile, Brandy was somehow managing to block my mail delivery and interfere with supply deliveries for my electrical jobs, claiming that my cabin was under investigation and therefore restricted access. The legal threats reached a new level when Mark Keller, Bry's accountant husband, sent me a cease and desist letter that was obviously copied from some online template. The letter demanded that I stop harassing HOA members and threatened legal action within 10 days if I didn't comply with community standards and cease all disruptive activities. The language was deliberately vague and legally meaningless, but it was clearly meant to intimidate someone who didn't understand their rights. What made it particularly insulting was that I hadn't done anything except defend my own property. I was the one being harassed, not the other way around. The letter also included a revised buyout offer that was even lower than the original, now claiming that recent developments and community concerns had reduced my property value significantly. It was extortion, plain and simple, and Brandy was getting bolder with each escalation. I responded by documenting everything meticulously, using my technical training to install a professional security camera system around my property that would capture any future trespassing or harassment. As an electrician, I knew how to set up monitoring equipment that would hold up in court if necessary, and I made sure every camera was properly positioned and legally compliant. I also finally consulted with a real lawyer about the bridge ownership situation, and the news was even better than I'd hoped. Not only did I legally own the bridge, but I had exclusive rights to control access, including the authority to close it for maintenance or safety inspections whenever necessary. "This is an incredibly strong legal position," the lawyer explained. "If they're harassing you about your property rights, they're essentially trying to interfere with infrastructure that they depend on completely." Frank continued providing intelligence about Bry's planning sessions with her inner circle. Apparently, she'd scheduled a meeting with potential investors who were interested in her resort development scheme, and she was promising them that my cabin would be resolved within the next few weeks. "She's telling people she's got connections at the city planning office and that your place is going to be condemned for safety violations," Frank reported. "The woman's living in a fantasy world, but she's got enough people convinced that she's starting to believe her own lies." Meanwhile, Elise Harper was reaching a breaking point with the ethical conflicts of her position. Brandy had been pressuring her to falsify HOA meeting minutes and create fake documentation to support the harassment campaign against me. She threatened to sabotage my scholarship applications if I don't help her build a case against you. Elise confided to Frank, who passed the information along to me. The psychological pressure was definitely getting to me. I'd moved to this cabin for peace and quiet, to build an honest living as a skilled tradesman in a community where people respected hard work and integrity. Now I was dealing with surveillance, legal threats, and a coordinated campaign to destroy my reputation and force me out of my own home. There were moments when I wondered if it would be easier to just take whatever money Brandy was offering and start over somewhere else. But every time I looked at my grandfather's old green leather jacket hanging by the door, or caught sight of the bridge he'd strategically purchased to protect this place, I remembered that some fights are worth having. Brandy Keller had picked the wrong person to mess with, and she was about to find out exactly how wrong she'd been. The question was whether she'd back down when she realized her mistake, or if she'd double down and force me to use the nuclear option I was keeping in reserve. Rye's final escalation came in the form of an emergency community meeting that she organized to address what she dramatically called the security threat to our children and families. She wore the most blindingly bright neon yellow shirt I'd ever seen, paired with a jacket that looked like it was made from traffic cone material. The meeting was held in the subdivision's community center, and she'd managed to pack the room with about 50 residents who'd been fed a steady diet of rumors and misinformation about my supposedly dangerous presence in their neighborhood. She'd prepared a fake petition claiming unanimous community concern about my cabin, complete with forged signatures and fabricated complaints about everything from property values to child safety. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, with the dramatic flair of a prosecutor delivering closing arguments, "our property values have already dropped 15% because of the eyesore that Mr. Brooks refuses to address." The lies flowed so smoothly that I almost admired her ability to manipulate the crowd's emotions. But Bry's biggest mistake was bringing up the old cannabis scandal from before Id inherited the cabin. In front of the entire crowd, she launched into a detailed character assassination that was clearly designed to humiliate me and destroy any community support I might have had. "We all know about the criminal history associated with that property," she declared, her voice dripping with
false righteousness.
"Mr. Brooks may claim he's cleaned up that situation, but do we really want his type in our family-oriented community? Can we trust someone who chooses to live in a place with that kind of background?" She went on to suggest that I might be continuing illegal activities, that my presence was a threat to their children, and that the community needed to take action to protect our way of life. It was a masterclass in public shaming, and I could see the effect it was having on the crowd, as neighbors who'd known me for years started looking at me with suspicion and fear. Diane Marshall had heard enough. Rising from her seat in the middle of the packed community center, she interrupted Bry's tirade with a voice that carried the authority of someone who'd done her homework. "I've been documenting your financial irregularities for months, Brandy," Diane announced to the shocked crowd. "You've been misusing HOA funds to pay for personal legal fees, hiring unlicensed contractors for association work, and collecting kickbacks from vendors who overcharge for maintenance projects." The room fell silent as Diane continued her accusations, pulling out a folder full of evidence she'd been gathering. "This isn't about community safety. This is about covering up your own misconduct by creating a distraction." Bry's face went white as she realized that her secret enemy had chosen this moment to strike back, turning her own public forum into an indictment of her leadership. I sat through the entire performance, feeling the weight of 50 pairs of eyes judging me based on lies and half-truths, but also witnessing Bry's support base crumble in real time as Diane's accusations hit home. Frank was there looking uncomfortable, but nodding in agreement with Diane's revelations about the HOA's financial problems. Several other residents seemed shocked to learn about the fiscal mismanagement that had been happening behind the scenes. Elise Harper was taking notes in the corner, her face pale with what I now realized was relief. that someone else was finally speaking the truth about Bry's corruption. The worst part was seeing how Brandy tried to regain control by doubling down on her attacks against me, becoming more vicious and desperate as she sensed her authority slipping away. "Don't let them distract you from the real issue," she shouted, pointing directly at me. "Mr. Brooks thinks he can just ignore our community standards and live however he wants, but this is about protecting everything we've built here." After the meeting devolved into chaos, with residents arguing among themselves about Deanne's accusations and Bry's increasingly hysterical responses, Elise approached me privately in the parking lot. Her hands were shaking as she confessed what had been happening behind the scenes, and she was clearly terrified of the consequences of speaking up. "Brandy made me help her plan this whole thing," she whispered, constantly looking around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "She's been threatening my scholarship, saying she'll contact the university and tell them I'm unreliable if I don't do exactly what she wants." But what happened in there was wrong, and I recorded the whole meeting on my phone. She explained that Brandy had been falsifying HOA documents, misusing community funds for personal expenses, and coordinating with her gossip mums to spread lies about multiple residents she wanted to pressure into selling their property. "She's not just after your cabin, Mr. Brooks. You're just the first target in a much bigger plan to take over properties around the subdivision." The most damaging revelation came when Elise showed me text messages between Brandy and her inner circle planning the character assassination strategy they'd used at the meeting. "Look at this," Elise said, scrolling through the evidence on her phone. She literally wrote out a script for tonight, including the fake statistics about property
values and the stuff about your cabin being a criminal enterprise.
She knew everything she was saying was a lie. The messages also revealed that Brandy had been coordinating with her fake building inspector to create false safety violations, and that she'd been paying the private security guards to harass not just me but several other property owners who refused to cooperate with her development schemes. It was a conspiracy that went far deeper than just my situation. And Elise had documented all of it because she was afraid of being implicated in Bry's illegal activity. Walking back to my cabin that night, wearing my comfortable blue hoodie and feeling more isolated than I'd felt since moving here, I stared out at the old bridge and made a decision. Brandy Keller had crossed every line of decency and fairness, but she'd also made a crucial tactical error by attacking me publicly while her own house was falling down around her. She thought she held all the power, but she'd never bothered to research who actually controlled the infrastructure her entire subdivision depended on. Diane's revolt had shown that Bry's support was weaker than it appeared, and Elisa's evidence proved that she'd been breaking the law in multiple ways. It was time to remind her that real power doesn't come from intimidation and manipulation. It comes from holding the keys to something people actually need. The game was about to change, and Brandy had no idea what was coming, but first I needed to let her dig her hole just a little bit deeper. The next morning, I quietly filed the official bridge ownership documentation with the city planning office, making sure every legal detail was properly recorded and verified. My strategic alliance was coming together nicely. Frank continued, providing insider information about HOA meetings and Bry's planning sessions. While Elise had agreed to share her recordings of Bry's most damaging statements and her evidence of financial irregularities in the HOA budget, Diane Marshall was coordinating her own political challenge to Bry's leadership, and we'd agreed that working together would benefit everyone who wanted to see real change in the community. I was transforming from a reactive victim into a strategic mastermind, and it felt good to finally be taking control of the situation. Instead of just defending myself against Bry's attacks, my preliminary moves were subtle but effective. Using my electrical expertise, I installed a legitimate professional security system that would document any future harassment or trespassing, making sure every camera was positioned to capture activity around both my cabin and the bridge approaches. I also began what I called routine bridge maintenance inspection, filing the proper permits with the city and posting official notices about upcoming infrastructure assessment work. The beauty of this approach was that everything I was doing was completely legal and transparent. I was just exercising my legitimate property rights as the bridge owner. To anyone who knew what to look for, it was obvious that I was preparing for something big, but Brandy was too focused on her own schemes to pay attention to what I was actually doing. Bry's fatal overconfidence reached new heights when she announced her final victory to anyone who would listen, telling people that my cabin situation would be permanently resolved within the week. She'd scheduled a celebration meeting with her potential resort investors, and she was already spending money she hadn't earned yet on custom champagne and party supplies for what she called her community future celebration. The event was planned for the following Saturday, and she'd invited the entire subdivision to come celebrate the successful resolution of our neighborhood's biggest challenge. She was even wearing increasingly elaborate yellow outfits to each planning meeting, including a golden blazer that looked like it was made from actual metallic fabric. "She's completely lost touch with reality," Frank reported after one of these planning sessions. "He's talking like she's already won and you've already disappeared." Behind the scenes, my lawyer had confirmed that my bridge ownership position was absolutely ironclad, including exclusive access rights that gave me complete control over who could use the bridge and when. The historical property records showed that the bridge had been privately owned since the 1940s, long before the subdivision existed, and that all current residents had been using it under what legally amounted to an informal easement that could be modified or revoked by the property owner. "This is an incredibly strong legal position," my lawyer explained during our consultation. "If you choose to exercise your rights as the bridge owner, there's really nothing they can do to stop you legally. The question is just how you want to handle the situation strategically." Frank's intelligence network revealed that Brandy had been telling her investors that she had connections at City Hall who would help her condemn my cabin for safety violations, and that she'd already secured preliminary approval for her resort development project. None of this was true, of course, but it showed how completely disconnected from reality she'd become. Elise had been documenting these false claims in her meeting notes, building a comprehensive record of Bry's deception and fraud that could be used to remove her from the HOA presidency and potentially pursue legal action against her. "She's been telling different lies to different people," Elise explained, "and eventually those lies are going to catch up with her. The problem is, she's dragging the whole community down with her delusions." The character development happening within our little resistance movement was remarkable to watch. I was evolving from a defensive victim into someone who understood how to use strategic thinking and patience to outmaneuver a bully. Elise was finding the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it meant risking her scholarship and financial security. Frank was proving that sometimes the most effective resistance comes from people who've been quietly watching and waiting for the right moment to act. Even Diane Marshall was discovering her own political skills as she prepared to challenge Bry's leadership through proper channels. We were all becoming stronger and more confident as we worked together toward our common goal. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for Bry's community future celebration. She'd sent out invitations to the entire subdivision, promising food, drinks, and exciting announcements about our neighborhood's bright future. What she didn't know was that she'd inadvertently invited everyone to witness her own spectacular downfall. I spent Friday night preparing for what would either be the most satisfying moment of this entire ordeal or a complete disaster if my strategy backfired. Either way, Brandy Keller was about to learn that real power doesn't come from intimidation and manipulation. It comes from doing your homework and understanding who actually controls the things that matter. Saturday afternoon arrived with beautiful sunshine that seemed to highlight every gaudy detail of Bry's golden yellow dress, a metallic monstrosity that looked like she had wrapped herself in gift paper for the occasion. The community future. Celebration was in full swing in the subdivision's community centre, with about 60 residents enjoying catered food and drinks, while Brandy gave a speech about our victory over the elements that threatened our community's prosperity. She was absolutely glowing with what she thought was triumph, telling everyone how her leadership had successfully resolved the cabin situation and cleared the way for exciting new development opportunities that will increase all of our property values. The irony was almost too perfect. She was celebrating a victory she hadn't actually achieved in front of people who were about to discover just how completely wrong she'd been about everything. I arrived at the celebration wearing my comfortable blue hoodie and carrying a folder full of official documents, accompanied by a city building inspector and a sheriff's deputy who'd agreed to witness what was about to happen. The moment I walked into the community centre, the conversation level dropped noticeably as people recognized me and wondered what I was doing at Bry's victory party. She spotted me immediately, and her golden smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "Well, look who decided to join us," she announced to the crowd, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I hope Mr. Brooks is here to apologize for all the trouble he's caused our community." The laughter from her supporters was nervous and uncertain, as if they sensed that something wasn't quite right about this situation. I walked to the front of the room where Brandy had set up a small podium for her presentations and asked if I could make a brief announcement to the assembled residents.
Of course, she said, clearly confident that whatever I had to say would only make her look better by comparison. I'm sure everyone would love to hear what you have to say. I thanked her for the opportunity and then began pulling documents from
my folder, explaining to the surprised crowd that I'd recently discovered some interesting information about the infrastructure their subdivision depended on. "It turns out," I said, holding up the bridge ownership deed for everyone to see, "that I own Old Mill Bridge, the only road in or out of Willowbrook Heights. This ownership has been in my family since the 1940s, long before this subdivision existed." The room went completely silent as people processed what I just told them. Bry's golden dress seemed to dim as the color drained from her face, and I could see her mind racing to understand the implications of what she just learned. "Furthermore," I continued, "I filed all the proper paperwork with the city to conduct a comprehensive safety inspection of the bridge, which will require closing it to all traffic for 30 days starting Monday morning." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before someone in the crowd asked the obvious question. "Does that mean we can't leave the subdivision?" I nodded gravely and explained that bridge safety was a serious matter that couldn't be compromised and that the inspection was long overdue according to city engineering standards. The immediate reaction was chaos. Parents started panicking about getting their children to school, workers worried about getting to their jobs, and elderly residents who depended on regular medical appointments began asking how they were supposed to get to their doctors. Bry's carefully planned celebration turned into a community emergency meeting as people realized that their entire way of life depended on infrastructure they didn't control. Her potential investors, who'd been enjoying free champagne and listening to promises about resort development opportunities, quickly made excuses and left when they understood the legal nightmare they'd almost walked into.
"This is ridiculous." Brandy finally exploded, her composure cracking completely. "You can't just shut down a public road because you're angry about some HOA violations." That's when Elise Harper stood up and presented her evidence in front of the
entire community. She played recordings of Bry's most damaging statements, including her admissions of spreading false rumors about me her threats to sabotage scholarship applications, and her discussions about using fabricated safety violations to condemn my cabin. "Mrs. Keller has been lying to all of you," Elise announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "She's been misusing HOA funds, falsifying documents, and coordinating harassment campaigns against residents she wants to force out of their homes." Frank stood up to corroborate Elisa's testimony, adding his own first-hand knowledge of Bry's behind-the-scenes scheming and her attempts to manipulate city officials. Diane Marshall seized the moment to call for an emergency vote to remove E.T. Brandy from her position as HOA president. "We can't allow this kind of corruption and abuse of power to continue," she declared, and the motion was quickly seconded by multiple residents who'd finally seen enough evidence of Bry's misconduct. The vote was overwhelming, 43 in favor of removal, with only 7 residents still supporting Brandy, mostly her original Gossip Mom crew, who'd been complicit in her schemes. Even Mark Keller, her own husband, abstained from the vote and publicly distanced himself from her actions. "I've been telling Brandy for months that this was going too far," he announced, finally finding his spine after years of just saying yes, dear to everything. "I'm done enabling these schemes." Bry's spectacular downfall was complete, but I wasn't finished yet. After she'd been formally removed from office and forced to apologize publicly for her harassment campaign against me, I announced that I was willing to reopen the bridge immediately under certain conditions. The HOA would need to provide a formal, written apology acknowledging their wrongful treatment of me, and they would need to make a $10,000 donation to the local veterans charity in recognition of the harm they'd caused to the community. "I'm not interested in punishing innocent people for their leadership's mistakes," I explained to the relieved crowd. "I just want to make sure this kind of abuse never happens again." The resolution was better than I could have hoped for. Diane Marshall was elected as the new HOA president, and her first official act was to establish clear boundaries about what the organization could and couldn't regulate, ensuring that property owners outside the subdivision would never again be subjected to harassment about community standards. Several residents approached me privately to apologize for believing Bry's lies and for not speaking up when they saw what was happening. The community actually began functioning better without Bry's toxic influence, with neighbors talking to each other directly instead of going through a power-hungry intermediary who had her own agenda. That evening I sat on my cabin porch, wearing my comfortable blue hoodie, watching the sunset and sipping coffee from my favorite mug. Frank stopped by with cold beer and genuine friendship, something that had been missing from my life during the months of harassment and stress. "You know, Ethan," he said, settling into the chair beside me, "sometimes the best way to win a war is to let your enemy defeat themselves." I smiled, looking out at my peaceful kingdom and the bridge that had protected it, just as my grandfather had intended. "Grandpa would be proud," I said, raising my coffee mug in a toast to the old man's wisdom. The bridge stood strong in the fading light, a reminder that real power comes from understanding what people actually need and being patient enough to use that knowledge wisely. Thanks for watching QA Stories. Share this video with someone who loves a good plot twist.